The morning Dara Whitfield drove her Lexus into the side of a man's truck. She didn't even slow down to check if he was hurt first. She checked her bumper. The truck was parked halfway off the shoulder of Route 9, just past the Millhaven town line, its hazard lights blinking in the gray November drizzle. Dara had been on her phone, not texting, she would tell herself later, just glancing, and when she looked up, the rear corner of that rusted green Ford was right there, unmovable as a fact. The impact wasn't catastrophic. A crunch, a jolt, her coffee sliding off the cup holder and spilling across her cream-colored wool coat. She pulled over, got out, and walked straight to the front of her Lexus. A crease, a cracked fog light. She exhaled through her nose. "You're going to need to move your vehicle," she said, without yet looking at the man standing by the truck's open hood. "You're barely off the road. This is a driving hazard." The man didn't answer immediately. He lowered the hood slowly, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and turned to look at her. He was somewhere in his late 30s, tall, wearing a canvas jacket with a frayed collar. There was grease on his forearm and something careful in his eyes, the kind of careful that comes from practice, from years of deciding what not to say. "The alternator went," he said. "I pulled over as far as I could." Well, not far enough. Dara was already reaching into her coat for her phone. "I'm going to need your insurance information, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't make this difficult." The man looked at the dent in his truck's rear panel for a moment. It was barely distinguishable from the other dents. He looked back at her. "You hit me," he said. It wasn't accusatory, it was almost gentle, like he was offering a correction. "Your truck was in the lane. The hazards were on." "I don't have time for this." She pulled up her insurance app. Name: Garrett Solon. She typed it in. He didn't ask for hers. That bothered her more than if he'd argued. They exchanged information on the side of the road in the rain. Garrett wrote his number on the back of a receipt he pulled from his jacket pocket. His handwriting was clean and deliberate. Dara photographed the damage on both vehicles, sent it to her assistant, and arranged for a tow truck to come for the Ford. She did this without asking him if that's what he wanted. She assumed it was. "Someone will call you," she told him. "About the repairs. We'll cover whatever's necessary." Garrett looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Okay." "You're welcome," she said, and got back in her Lexus. She drove the rest of the way to Millhaven, thinking about the quarterly report she was already late preparing. Her father's company, Whitfield Land and Development, was 3 weeks from closing on a 40-acre parcel outside of town, and the county variance hearing had been moved up. There was no room in her calendar for rusted trucks or men who looked at her like she'd said something wrong without saying anything at all. Garrett Solon lived in a house he had mostly built himself on a quarter-acre lot at the edge of Millhaven where the road turned to gravel. He had a daughter named Wren, who was 8 years old and very serious about frogs. She kept a notebook of frogs she'd identified in the creek behind their yard, with hand-drawn illustrations and Latin names she'd looked up at the library. Garrett had framed the first page and hung it in the kitchen. He made dinner that night, pasta, because it was Tuesday and Tuesdays were pasta, and while Wren told him about a Pacific tree frog she'd read about that could survive being frozen, he thought about the woman on Route 9. He didn't think about her the way a person thinks about someone they're drawn to. He thought about her the way a person thinks about a thing they've been waiting for and didn't expect to arrive like this. He'd known who she was before she introduced herself. Dara Whitfield. He'd seen her photo in the county planning documents and again in the Millhaven Gazette when the land deal was announced. Whitfield Land and Development. He knew that name the way you know the name of a storm. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her father, Thomas Whitfield, had asked Garrett to deliver something to her, not recently. 3 years ago, 2 weeks before Thomas died, he'd pressed an envelope into Garrett's hands in the parking lot of Millhaven General and said, "Not yet. You'll know when." Garrett hadn't known when until now. Her assistant called him 2 days later about the truck. The repair estimate came in at just over $400. Garrett told the assistant he could have his own mechanic look at it, and the woman said, very briskly, that Ms. Whitfield preferred to use their preferred vendor for liability reasons. Garrett said that was fine. 3 days after that, Dara Whitfield appeared at his front door. She was holding a folder. Her coat was different from the one she'd been wearing on Route 9, darker, less likely to show damage, and her hair was pulled back in a way that made her look more like someone preparing for a confrontation than someone paying a friendly visit. I wanted to follow up in person, she said, about the repairs. Garrett stepped back and held the door open. You want to come in? She seemed to weigh this, briefly. His house was clean in the way that houses are when a single parent has learned to be efficient. A pair of child's rain boots by the door. A half-finished birdhouse on the kitchen table. A stack of library books, the top one about wetland ecosystems. Dara stood in the entryway and looked at the frog drawing in the frame. Your daughter? She asked. Wren. She's at school. How old? Aunt. 8. Something crossed her face. Not quite softness, but an opening. Then it closed again. The repair shop said the truck has some pre-existing frame issues. We're not responsible for anything that predates the accident. I know, Garrett said. I didn't ask you to be. She looked at him again with that expression he couldn't place. Or rather, he could. He just hadn't expected to see it on her. It was the expression of someone who had spent a long time waiting for people to push back and had built an entire personality around the anticipation of it. Why do you keep looking at me like that? She asked. Like what? Like you know something. Garrett said, Can I get you a cup of coffee? She stayed for 40 minutes. She didn't mean to. She had a call at 2 and a site visit at 3:30 and a dinner she'd committed to with her mother that she was already dreading, because her mother spent every dinner asking when Dara was going to slow down, as if slowing down were something a person could just decide to do, like changing a shirt. But she sat at Garrett's kitchen table with a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for, and something about the quiet of his house made the urgency in her chest ease, just slightly, like a fist unclenching one finger at a time. He asked her how long she'd been running her father's company. She told him 3 years. He asked if she'd grown up in Millhaven. She said yes, but she'd left at 18 and only came back after her father got sick. He didn't ask what brought her back. She found herself answering anyway. He needed someone, she said. My brother's in Portland. It wasn't a choice, really. Sometimes those are the easiest decisions, Garrett said, when it's not a choice. She looked at him. That's a strange way to put it. My wife left when Wren was 2, he said simply, like he was telling her the weather. I stayed, not because I calculated it, because there wasn't a version of me that didn't. Dara looked down at her coffee. She left at 2:15 in a hurry, without saying goodbye the way she normally did, which was efficiently like a transaction completed. She just said, "Thank you for the coffee," and walked out. On the drive to her site visit, she thought about the way he'd said, there wasn't a version of me that didn't. She thought about it more than she wanted to. The land deal was with a 40-acre parcel that sat on the north edge of Millhaven along Crane Creek. It had been farmland once. Now, it was overgrown and beautiful in that specific way that abandoned places get when nature stops being managed and starts just being. Whitfield Land and Development planned to build 112 luxury units there. Dara had reviewed the environmental impact report. It was compliant. It had to be compliant. That was what the lawyers said. What the lawyers hadn't told her, what she hadn't known to ask, was that Thomas Whitfield had made a promise to the people who'd sold him that land. There had been a family, the Hendersons. They'd farmed the North 40 for 60 years before drought and debt made it impossible. When Thomas bought the land, he'd told Earl Henderson that the creek would be preserved, that no construction would come within 200 feet of the waterway. that the land along Crane Creek would stay green. It wasn't in the contract. It was a handshake and a man's word. Thomas Whitfield had kept that word for 8 years. Then he got sick, and the company passed to Dara, and the architects came back with revised plans that reduced the setback to 80 feet, because the soil data supported it, and the county variance was achievable, and it made the project viable. Dara hadn't known about the promise. Nobody had told her, but someone had written it down. The envelope had been sitting in Garrett's dresser drawer for 3 years, under a spare watch battery and a photograph of Wren as a newborn. He hadn't opened it. Thomas had asked him not to, not until the time was right, and Garrett had honored that the way he honored most things, quietly and without requiring anyone to thank him for it. He and Thomas had known each other for 6 years before Thomas died. Garrett had built the pergola behind the Whitfield house, and then the bookshelves in Thomas's study, and somewhere in the course of all that Thomas had started talking to him the way people talk to someone they've decided to trust. Not because that person asked for their trust, but because they simply seemed like the kind of person who would carry it carefully. Thomas had told Garrett about the Henderson promise 18 months before he died. He'd told him about Celia Henderson, Earl's granddaughter, who still lived in Millhaven, and who would be the one most affected when the development reached the creek bank. He'd told him about Dara, how she was brilliant and hard, and had built walls so high that most people gave up trying to climb them. How she was also, underneath all of that, a woman who needed to know that her father had tried to do something right. "She thinks I didn't," Thomas had said. "And some of that is fair, but not all of it. I need her to know the part that isn't." The envelope contained a letter. Garrett knew this because Thomas had told him. He didn't know what the letter said. He'd been thinking, since Dara walked into his kitchen and sat down at his table, that maybe now was when. She came back 5 days later. Not to his house. She ran into him at the Millhaven Library, where he was returning Wren's ecosystem books and checking out 2 more. Dara was there because the county records office was in the back of the building, and she needed to pull the original variance filings. They stood in the parking lot afterward with their respective folders. "How's the truck?" she asked. "Back and running. Your vendor did good work." "I'll tell them." A pause. The sky was low and white, the kind that threatened snow without committing. "I have something for you," Garrett said. "It was your father's." She went still. "What do you mean?" "He gave it to me before he died. He asked me to hold it until the right time." He looked at her steadily. "I think this is the right time. The Crane Creek parcel, the plans, the setback reduction. I think this is what he was waiting for." The color changed in her face. Not drained, exactly, but shifted, like something beneath the surface was rearranging. "How do you know about the Crane Creek setback?" "Your father told me, 3 years ago." "You knew my father." "It wasn't a question, it was a recalibration. He hired me to build the pergola, and then we talked a lot. He was a man who liked to talk once he decided to trust you." Dara looked at him for a long moment. "And you didn't say anything? When I came to your door, when I sat in your kitchen?" No. "Why not?" Garrett said, "Because you weren't ready." She made a sound that was almost a laugh but wasn't. "You don't know me well enough to make that call." "That's fair," he said. "I'm making it anyway." She drove home with a white envelope on the passenger seat and didn't open it for 2 hours. She made herself eat something first. She changed out of her work clothes. She sat in the chair by the window where Thomas used to read, and she held the envelope in both hands, and she thought about her father the way she tried not to think about him. Not as the man she'd argued with, not as the CEO whose decisions she'd inherited, but as a person, just a person who had built things and broken things, and apparently written one of them down. She opened it. Thomas Whitfield's handwriting was cramped and slanted, worse in the years before he died when his hands had started to shake. The letter was 2 pages, front and back. He wrote about Earl Henderson and the promise he'd made. He wrote about Celia, Earl's granddaughter, who had been 14 when the farm was sold, and who had cried in the driveway while her grandfather shook Thomas's hand. He had watched that and carried it. He wrote about the company, how it started it to build something real, and how somewhere along the way building something real had become building something profitable, and how those two things had slowly stopped being the same. He wrote about Dara, not to instruct her, not to manage her from beyond the grave, just to tell her, plainly in his cramped and shaking handwriting, that he had watched her take over with the kind of ferocity that only comes from a person who is also afraid, and that he recognized it because it was his ferocity too, and it was the thing he was most proud of in her, and also the thing he worried about most. The creek matters, he wrote, not because it's pretty, because I told an old man his granddaughter could still walk there. If you're reading this, you're about to decide whether my word was worth anything. I think you'll decide right. I'm sorry I didn't say all of this in person. I kept thinking there was more time. There wasn't more time. There never was. Dara sat in that chair until the light outside went from white to gray to black. She cried once briefly, the way she'd trained herself to cry, quickly and privately and without an audience. Then she got up and called her attorney. The variance hearing went 11 days. The revised plans, the ones with the 80-foot setback, were already filed. Undoing them wasn't impossible, but it wasn't simple either. It would cost money. It would delay. It would delay the project. It would require a conversation with the board that she was not looking forward to having. She had the conversation the next morning. She also drove to the address Thomas had listed in his letter, a small house on the east side of Millhaven where Celia Henderson lived with her husband and 2 kids. She knocked on the door and introduced herself and said she wanted to talk about Crane Creek. Celia Henderson was 32 years old and had her grandfather's eyes. She looked at Dara the way people look at something they've stopped expecting. My father made a promise, Dara said. I'm going to keep it. Celia didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, You want to come in? She called Garrett that evening. He answered on the second ring. I read it, she said. I know. How do you know? You sound different. She was quiet for a moment. He said you were someone he could trust. He was right to. I'm going back to the original setback. 200 feet from the creek. We'll figure out the finances. She paused. You probably saved us from a lawsuit, incidentally. Celia knew about the promise. She has an email from my father. If we'd broken ground with the 80-foot plan, she had a case. Your father probably knew that, Garrett said. He was protecting us, Dara said. Even then, even from the thing he was afraid we'd do. Garrett said, he talked about you a lot. He was proud of you, more than you know. She didn't cry, but it was close. I owe you an apology, she said. On Route 9. I was condescending, and I assumed things, and I checked my bumper before I checked if you were okay. I noticed that. I'm sorry. Thank you, he said. And then, after a beat, Wren has a frog identification walk this Saturday at the Nature Preserve. She's been asking if she can bring someone who isn't me. You'd probably have to crouch in wet grass. Dara looked at the letter, still on the table where she'd left it. Her father's handwriting, cramped and shaking, and telling her the truth. What time? She said. The variance was revised. The plans were redrawn. It cost the company $160,000 in redesign fees and pushed the timeline back by 4 months. The board was not pleased. 2 members resigned in protest. Dara presented the new plans herself and answered every question without flinching. On the day the revised plans were approved, she drove out to Crane Creek alone. It was a Sunday, cold enough for her breath to show. The water was low and clear, running over smooth stones in the particular way that water runs when no one has interfered with it. Cottonwoods along the bank, bare in December. A heron, standing in the shallows like it, had always been there. She stood there for a while and thought about her father. Not the arguments. Not the years she'd spent proving something to him that maybe didn't need proving. Just Thomas Whitfield, who had watched a 14-year-old girl cry in a driveway and spent the next 18 years trying to make it mean something. She thought about Garrett. How he'd kept that envelope for 3 years without opening it, without using it, without once making it about himself. How that kind of faithfulness was its own thing entirely, a kind of character she hadn't thought to look for because she hadn't known it still existed in the world. She thought about Wren, crouching in the wet grass at the nature preserve 2 weeks earlier, absolutely certain about every frog she saw. The confidence of a child who has been loved steadily enough to trust her own observations. She didn't know what came next between her and Garrett. She wasn't someone who let herself get too far ahead of a thing. But she knew she would go back to that house on the gravel road. She knew she would sit at that table again. She knew that the version of herself she was becoming, the one that checked on the person for the bumper, that kept promises, even expensive ones, that stood at the edge of a creek and understood why it mattered. She liked that version better. Wren had shown her a page from the frog notebook that Saturday, a drawing of a wood frog with careful detail on the dorsal ridge. They can freeze completely in winter, Wren had told her, very seriously, and then thaw out and be fine in spring. Isn't that something? Dara had looked at the drawing and thought, yes. Yes, that really is something. The heron lifted off the water, slow and enormous, and crossed the creek without a sound. She drove back to Millhaven with the heater on and the radio off, and for the first time in a long time she didn't think about what was next. She just let the road be the road and the trees be the trees, and let herself take up exactly as much space as she needed. No more, no less, which she was beginning to understand had been her father's wish for her all along. I keep thinking about that envelope, sitting in a dresser drawer for 3 years. Under a spare watch battery and a photograph, unopened. Unopened. Not because Garrett forgot about it, but because he was waiting for the moment when it would actually mean something instead of just land. That kind of patience is rare. Most of us, if we're being honest, would have found a reason to deliver it sooner, told ourselves we were being helpful. Really, we just would have wanted to be done carrying it. But Garrett understood something that takes most people a lifetime to learn. Doing the right thing at the wrong time is still doing it wrong. What strikes me most about this story is how cause and consequence move slowly. Dara didn't crash into a stranger's truck. She crashed into the consequence of every choice her father made, the promise he kept for 8 years, the man he trusted to carry it forward, the granddaughter of a farmer who cried in a driveway at 14 and never forgot. None of that was visible to her on Route 9. She just saw a dent in her bumper and a man she could dismiss. That's usually how it works. The weight of what we've inherited tends to be invisible until it isn't. Thomas Whitfield wasn't a perfect man. The letter made that clear. He'd watched the company drift from something real into something profitable, and he'd let it happen, and somewhere in the last years of his life, he'd decided that admitting that mattered more than protecting his reputation. That took a kind of honesty I think most people never get to. Not intelligence, exactly. He was smart enough to know what he'd done long before he wrote it down. It was something closer to courage, the willingness to say, I got this wrong, and I'm going to say so, even if I'm not here to see what comes of it. Dara had her father's sharpness, but not yet his willingness to be wrong. What I find moving is how quickly she moved once she had the information she needed. She didn't stall. She didn't negotiate with herself for weeks. She called her attorney the same night she finished the letter. She drove to Celia's house the next morning. She stood in front of her board and didn't flinch. That's not just doing the right thing. That's doing it without waiting for it to become convenient, which it never does. I think about Wren telling Dara about wood frogs. How they freeze completely in winter and thaw out in spring, whole and functional and fine. Wren said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. I think Dara heard something in it that Ren wasn't old enough to mean yet. That being stopped, being frozen, being in a place where nothing moves, doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes it's just winter. What we owe each other, I think, is exactly what Garrett gave Thomas and then gave Dara. Careful handling, not fixing, not rescuing. Just, here is what was meant for you, and I kept it safe until you were ready for it. That's enough. That's actually everything.